I've been going back and forth on whether to post this for a while now. It's not the kind of story that has a clean ending or a satisfying explanation, which is part of why it's taken me so long to actually sit down and write it out. Most weird experiences you can kind of file away over time. You tell the story at a party, people get spooked or skeptical, and eventually it just becomes a funny thing that happened to you. This one never became that for me. I'm in my mid-20s now, and I still think about this almost every week. It happened when I was around 12, so we're talking 13 years of no answers. I grew up in a pretty ordinary suburb. Nothing particularly interesting about the area. It was one of those towns where the biggest thing going on was the high school football team and maybe a decent diner on the main strip. I went to a mid-sized elementary school, the kind with a big open schoolyard that backed up against a chain-link fence and a parking lot. The yard itself was just asphalt with some painted lines for games and a couple of benches along the far wall. Nothing remarkable. I knew every inch of that place. It was late May, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before summer break. I remember that detail clearly because the heat had already kicked in and everyone was mentally checked out of school. That particular afternoon was warm and bright. One of those days where the sunlight hits the asphalt and you can almost feel the heat bouncing back up at you. Lunch recess. I was out there with a handful of my friends. We weren't doing anything in particular, just standing around talking the way 12-year-olds do. I think we were arguing about something stupid, a video game or a movie or something completely forgettable. Normal day, normal afternoon. Nothing off about any of it. That's when it happened. I don't know how else to describe it except that I felt something. Not heard, not saw. Felt. Like a pressure shift or a switch that flipped in the back of my brain. The closest thing I can compare it to is that feeling you get when you're walking alone at night and you suddenly become absolutely certain that something is behind you, even though you heard nothing and have no logical reason to think so. That immediate, full-body certainty. Except this was during the middle of the day, surrounded by other kids, in the most familiar environment I knew. I turned around. I don't even remember deciding to. My body just did it. There was a figure standing maybe 20 or 25 feet away from me. I say figure because that's genuinely the most accurate word I have for it. It was the shape of a person, upright, roughly the right proportions, but it was completely black. Not dark clothing. Not someone standing in shadow. It was like looking at a void in the shape of a human being. Pure black, no features, no depth, just an absence of everything. And it was mid-throw. Its arm was coming forward, and something was already leaving its hand, heading toward me. I remember the next second feeling like it stretched out. I was looking at this thing, and I knew whatever it had thrown was coming at my face, and I couldn't move. My legs just stopped working. I was completely frozen. Not out of choice. My body had just locked up entirely. I remember my heart slamming in my chest and my stomach dropping like I'd stepped off a ledge. Then something hit me in the head. Here's the strange part. It didn't hurt. At least not in the way I expected. I felt a sharp impact on my forehead, right at the hairline, and then just this strange warm pressure. I stood there for a second and blinked, and by the time I turned back around to face my friends, the figure was gone. I hadn't even heard it leave. I just turned back and it was like it had never been there. I opened my mouth to say something to my friends. I think I was going to tell them what I'd just seen. But before I could get a word out, one of them screamed. Not a joking scream. A genuine, panicked shriek. And then they all backed away from me at once, and I didn't understand why until I saw the look on their faces. They were staring at my forehead. I reached up and felt something wet. I pulled my hand back and it was covered in blood. And not a small amount. I mean, head wounds bleed a lot, which I didn't know at the time, but this looked horrifying. It was already running down my face and dripping off my chin. One of my friends started yelling for a teacher and I just stood there, kind of blank, still not feeling any real pain. I remember thinking, in this very calm, detached way, that this was a lot of blood. Like I was observing it happening to someone else. My friends later told me that from their perspective, I just started bleeding. No object, no person throwing anything. I was standing there talking to them, I turned around, stood there for a second, turned back, and then blood was just pouring out of my head. That's it. That was the whole thing from where they were standing. None of them saw anything behind me. Not the figure, not the object, nothing. A teacher got to me pretty quickly and I was rushed inside. They called my parents, called an ambulance. The ER doctor told my mom I had a small but deep laceration just above my hairline, the kind that needed stitches rather than just a bandage. 4 stitches. He said it looked like I'd been struck by something with a hard edge. But when they asked me what had happened, I told them exactly what I'd seen, and I could already tell from the look they exchanged that nobody was going to take that seriously. They decided I must have walked into something or tripped and hit my head on the pavement, which I genuinely don't know how they squared with the fact that I was standing in the middle of an open yard when it happened. I went home that afternoon with 4 stitches and a bandage and a very confused version of events that I couldn't really argue my way out of. Here's where it actually gets strange. About a week later, after I was mostly healed up and back at school, my parents requested the security footage from that day. The school had cameras on the yard. Several of them, actually, mounted at different angles along the building. My parents weren't necessarily looking for anything supernatural. I think they were just trying to figure out what I had walked into or tripped over, and they were also probably making sure no other kid had done something to me that nobody was talking about. My dad sat me down and showed me what they'd found, or, more accurately, what they hadn't found. The footage was clear. Good quality, good angle. You could see the yard, you could see the kids, you could see me standing with my group of friends. You could watch me turn around. You could see me standing there for that second, frozen. And then you could see me turn back around and start bleeding. No figure. No object. Nothing coming from anywhere. No one within 20 feet of me in the direction I had turned. The camera had a clear line of sight to exactly the spot where I'd seen the thing standing, and there was just empty asphalt. 1 frame, nothing. Next frame, blood. My dad watched it 3 or 4 times. He didn't say much. I don't think he knew what to say. My mom asked me again, very calmly, to describe exactly what I had seen, and I told her again exactly what I've written here. The dark figure. The throwing motion. The slow motion second before impact. She listened, nodded, and then changed the subject. I don't think she changed the subject because she thought I was lying. I think she changed the subject because she didn't have anywhere to go with it. The laceration healed fine. I went back to school, finished the year, started summer break. Nobody really talked about it. My friends would bring it up occasionally at first, mostly in a half-joking way. Remember when you just started bleeding for no reason? Yeah, I remember. The object was never found. The school swept the yard the day after and turned up nothing. No rock, no piece of metal, nothing with an edge sharp enough to cut skin. The police were briefly involved, I think more out of procedural necessity than genuine investigation, and they also came up with nothing. I've thought about every rational explanation over the years. I've landed on and rejected all of them. Stress-induced something. A medical episode. A piece of debris that somehow left the frame before the camera could catch it. Some weird atmospheric thing. A prank that nobody's ever admitted to in 13 years, including former friends I'm still in contact with. None of them hold up when I look at them closely enough. What I keep coming back to is how real that figure was. I've had dreams. I know what my brain makes up when I'm half asleep or scared. This wasn't that. This was 12:30 in the afternoon, full sunlight, completely awake, and I saw something standing 20 feet away from me that had no business being there. Something that the camera couldn't see, that nobody else could see, that left no trace except for 4 stitches and a scar I still have just above my left eyebrow. I don't know what it was. I don't think I'm ever going to know. And honestly, the part that bothers me the most isn't the figure, or the bleeding, or even the footage. It's that feeling I had right before I turned around. That sudden, absolute certainty that something was behind me, watching me, waiting. Whatever it was, it wanted me to look. I don't talk about this one often, not because I think people won't believe me, but because even after all these years, I'm still not sure what I believe myself. There's this space between coincidence and something else, and that's exactly where this story lives. I've never been able to pull it fully into one category or the other, and I'm not sure I ever will. I grew up in a village in the Philippines. When I say village, I don't mean a tiny, isolated cluster of houses in the middle of nowhere. I mean a proper, living community with a real history and enough people that you knew most of them by face, and a decent number by name. The kind of place where everyone knew your parents and your grandparents, and where the older generation still held onto a set of beliefs that the younger people mostly rolled their eyes at but secretly respected. My parents weren't superstitious in an extreme way, but they knew the old stories. Everyone did. One of those beliefs, and this one was pretty common across a lot of communities in our country, was that seeing a person without their face was a warning, not a metaphor. Literally seeing someone with just smooth skin where their eyes, nose, and mouth should be. The belief was that if you encountered someone like that, it meant they were marked. Something bad was coming for them. Sickness, a serious accident, or most of the time, death. And there was a specific thing you were supposed to do if it happened to you. You were supposed to call the person's name 3 times, tell them to take off their clothes, burn or bury those clothes, and then stay inside for 3 full days. That was the ritual. That was how you pushed the danger back. I had heard this my entire life the same way you hear any old story growing up, half listening, not really filing it away as something you'd ever need. I was in 9th grade when I found out I was wrong about that. It was a regular afternoon. One of those warm, slightly hazy days that feel completely unremarkable when you're in the middle of them. My parents asked me to walk over to my grandmother's house on my mother's side and bring back some coconuts. My grandmother lived maybe a 15 or 20-minute walk away, depending on how fast I moved. I wasn't in any rush, so I wasn't moving fast. I remember doing that thing where you count the cars that pass you just to have something to do with your brain. I was pulling leaves off hedges as I walked, tearing them into strips. I was bored and I was 14 and it was just an errand. I was maybe halfway there when I saw him. He was coming from the opposite direction, walking toward me on the same side of the road. I recognized him immediately even from a distance. He was the husband of one of my distant relatives, a family that lived right next to my grandparents. I'd seen him my whole life. He wasn't someone I was close to, but he was familiar the way a lot of people in a small community are familiar. You know their face. You know roughly which house they live in. You'd nod at each other. I kept walking. He kept walking. We were closing the distance between us at a normal pace. And then, at some point, something stopped making sense. I noticed it gradually, which is what still bothers me about it. It wasn't like a jump scare. It crept in. The closer he got, the more I felt like something was wrong with what I was looking at, but I couldn't immediately place what it was. My brain was still insisting this was a normal situation. And then he was close enough that I couldn't tell myself that anymore. There was no face. I don't mean he looked strange or disfigured. I mean where his face should have been, there was just skin. Flat, featureless skin pulled over the shape of a head. No eyes. No nose. No mouth. Nothing. Just a smooth, unbroken surface where a person's face is supposed to be. And he was still walking. Still moving toward me like everything was normal. My legs stopped working for a second. I just stood there and stared, and my brain completely refused to process what it was seeing. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my throat. And then something kicked in, some very basic part of my brain that said, "Get away from this," and I turned around and I ran. I didn't make a decision. I just ran. I took a completely different road home, a longer way around that added probably 10 minutes to the walk, and the whole time I didn't look back once. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to see anything. The coconuts were completely forgotten. I just wanted to be inside my house with the door closed. By the time I got home, the adrenaline had started to wear off, and something else took over. Embarrassment, mostly. I had just sprinted away from a neighbor in broad daylight, taken a detour through half the village, and shown up at home empty-handed and out of breath. I started picking apart what I'd seen. The light had been hazy. I'd been spacing out, bored, not really paying attention. Maybe I just failed to register his features properly from a distance, and my brain had filled in something wrong. Face blindness was a real thing. Heat did weird things to your eyes. There were a dozen explanations that made more sense than what I thought I'd seen. I decided I wasn't going to mention it to anyone. I just started doing chores to shake it off. My dad came home that afternoon. He had news. The man I had seen on the road, the one I'd run from, had died. Sometime that day. I don't remember the exact details my dad gave, whether it was sudden, whether he'd been sick. I just remember standing there and feeling the floor drop out from under me. That feeling hit me in waves. The first one was just shock. Pure, blank shock. The second one was this deeply unsettling kind of recognition, like two things that should have nothing to do with each other had just snapped together. And the third one, the one that's never really left, was guilt. I thought about everything I hadn't done. I knew the ritual. I had heard it 100 times. Call the name 3 times. Tell them to take off their clothes. Get to their family. Something, anything. And I had done none of it. I had turned around and run home and convinced myself it was a trick of the light. I told my parents what I had seen. I don't know why I waited until after my dad told us about the death. I think some part of me needed what had happened to force it out of me. My mom's expression when I told her was hard to read. Not disbelief exactly, but not confirmation either. My dad said something like, "These things happen, and that I shouldn't be too hard on myself." They both said it was probably a coincidence. And maybe they were right. Maybe they were just trying to protect me from carrying something I didn't need to carry. But here's the thing I've never been able to let go of. The coincidence explanation requires that I randomly imagined a specific, detailed hallucination of a faceless person, and that this same person happened to die on the exact same day. That's not impossible. But it's a lot to swallow. And the other explanation requires that I actually saw what I think I saw, and I knew I had the information and I ran anyway. I still have the scar of that guilt. Not the dramatic, all-consuming kind. More like a low and persistent ache that surfaces when I think about it, which is still more often than I'd like. I've thought about what I would have done differently. If I had actually stopped. If I had called his name. If I had run to his house instead of mine. Maybe nothing would have changed. Probably nothing would have changed. But there's a version of that afternoon where I did something, where I at least tried, and I never got to find out what that version looked like. He had a wife. He had people who loved him. And on that road, on some level, I think I knew something was wrong. And I ran. I still think about him sometimes when I make that walk. I've been thinking about whether to write this out for a while now. Not because it's hard to talk about exactly, but because there are parts of it that I still don't have words for, and I hate telling a story I can't finish properly. This one doesn't finish properly. It just stops, which I think is almost worse than a real ending. Some context first, because the layout of where I lived matters more than it usually would. I grew up in a house in a residential area, somewhere that would look completely unremarkable to anyone passing through. Lots of houses close together, a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where you know roughly who lives where, and the biggest nightly disturbance is usually a dog barking at something down the road. Not remote. Not isolated. Just a normal neighborhood. But right behind our street, and I mean right there, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the back of our property, there was a small river. It wasn't wide or dramatic. More like a channel, really. It separated our street from the next one over, and because there was no bridge anywhere nearby, it had been left mostly alone for years. The banks were overgrown with trees and dense patches of bamboo in some sections. At night, that strip of riverbank was just darkness and sound. Water, mostly. Sometimes wind through the bamboo. It was one of those places that you got used to so completely that you stopped registering it, until you had a reason to start again. I was a teenager at the time, probably 16 or so. I went to school in the afternoons, which meant my mornings were free and my nights were completely my own. I had developed a habit of staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning without thinking much of it. I'd watch things on Netflix, read, scroll through my phone. The house was quiet by that point. My grandmother and my aunt, whose house was attached to ours, had been asleep for hours. We'd had a dog that stayed outside, but he had died recently, so the yard was empty at night. The one dog we had left slept inside with my aunt. The whole property was just quiet. I'd gotten used to that specific quality of silence, the particular sounds that belonged to it, which is exactly why I noticed when something new entered it. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. I was in my room on the second floor, lights on, just scrolling. Not tired, not really thinking about anything. And then I heard it. A woman's voice. Somewhere in the distance, coming from the direction of the river. She was crying and screaming the same 2 words over and over. Help me. My first reaction was to go still and listen harder. My second reaction was to talk myself out of it. I had a history of hearing things at the edge of sleep that turned out to be nothing, a half-dreamed sound that dissolved the moment I focused on it. I figured this was that. I kept listening, waiting for it to fade out the way those sounds usually did. It didn't fade. It got louder. Not suddenly. Gradually. The way a sound gets louder when the source of it is moving toward you. And that's when the feeling in my stomach changed. Because this wasn't a static sound at a fixed distance. It was approaching. She was approaching. Still crying, still screaming those 2 words, and now I could hear the breathlessness in it, like she'd been running, like she was exhausted and terrified and still moving. I turned my light off. I don't know exactly why that was my first instinct, but it was. I sat in the dark and I messaged a friend to tell them what I was hearing, partly because I wanted a witness and partly because I needed to tell someone or I was going to spiral. I kept waiting for the voice to say something else, something more specific. Call the police. I'm hurt. Something that would give me an action to take. But she never said anything except those 2 words, over and over, getting closer. Then I heard our front gate. It's a metal gate. I know the exact sound it makes. And I heard it close, which meant she had come through it. She was inside the yard. I sat completely still. I wasn't breathing the way I normally breathe. My heart was hammering and I had this absolutely horrible feeling, the kind that doesn't come from logic but from something deeper than that, the kind that just tells you something is very wrong. My room had blackout curtains, which I was suddenly more grateful for than I had ever been about anything. I pressed myself against the far wall and listened. The voice was right below my window. She was still crying, still saying it. And then, after what felt like a very long time, it moved away. The sound drifted back toward the direction of the river and eventually got far enough away that I couldn't make it out anymore. I sat in the dark for probably another 20 minutes before I turned my light back on. I didn't sleep until it was almost morning. The next day I mentioned it to my grandmother and my aunt over breakfast, trying to keep my voice casual, like it was just a strange thing I'd noticed and not something that had genuinely terrified me. They both said they hadn't heard anything. My grandmother didn't seem particularly concerned. My aunt suggested I had probably been half asleep and imagined it. I let them convince me. I told myself the same thing I always told myself when something weird happened late at night, which was that the brain does strange things in the dark when you've been awake too long, and it doesn't mean anything. That worked for exactly 1 night. The second night, it came back. I heard it from further away first, the same direction, the same voice, the same 2 words. And just like before, it got closer. This time, I turned my light off faster. I already knew the sound. I already knew where it was going. and I sat there in the dark again and listened to it make its way toward the house. Here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about those nights, the detail that I can't file away under sleep deprivation or an overactive imagination. The dogs. Our street had dogs. Not just ours. The neighbors had them too, multiple houses in either direction. And those dogs were not quiet animals on a normal night. If a person walked down our road at 2 in the morning, those dogs would have gone absolutely insane. That was just how it was. Any person, any animal, any unfamiliar thing moving through that neighborhood at night would have set off at least 2 or 3 of them, and they'd set each other off in a chain. Every time this woman came into our yard, there was complete silence from the dogs. Not a single bark. Not a whimper. Nothing. That silence was somehow worse than anything else. I heard her again maybe 5 or 6 more times over the following 2 or 3 months. I stopped trying to convince myself it wasn't real after the second night, but I also didn't know what to do with the information. My grandmother and my aunt genuinely seemed not to hear it, and I'd stopped bringing it up because I didn't have anywhere to take the conversation. Both times I managed to open my window to listen more clearly. I waited until the voice sounded like it was further from the house, down toward the river. The second time I managed to record a few seconds of it on my phone. The audio wasn't great, but it was there. It was real. It was a woman's voice crying and saying those words. I had proof. And then my phone broke, and I got a new one, and the recording was just gone. By the 3rd month, she came less frequently. And then she stopped coming altogether. I started going to sleep earlier on the nights I could manage it, partly out of exhaustion and partly because I had decided, not quite consciously, that I didn't want to be awake for it anymore. And eventually it just wasn't happening anymore, and life moved back to normal the way it does when you let something go by not looking at it directly. I still don't know what she was. I've thought about the obvious explanations. Someone in genuine distress, a woman being chased or hurt who happened to wander into our yard and then wander out again. I want that to be the answer. I genuinely do. But it doesn't hold up. Not when I think about the dogs. Something that unsettled me at that hour of the night should have had every dog on the street losing their minds. And they were silent. Every single time. Silent in a way they never were for anything else. The river is still there. The bamboo is still there. The neighborhood is still quiet at night in that same way. I don't stay up until 3 in the morning anymore. I'm not sure if that's because I grew out of it, or because some part of me decided not to find out if it would start again.